Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and this episode is coming to you just in time for Thanksgiving here at the end of 2024. This episode is a little late, and I just wanted to give you a quick administrative update, which is that I am barreling toward a deadline on one of my mystery books. So I've had to devote a bit more time to my writing in the past couple of weeks, and that is going to be the case for the immediate future. So for that reason, the next couple of episodes of All About Agatha are going to come out once every 3 weeks instead of once every 2 weeks. This is temporary. I will go back to my bi-weekly schedule pretty soon in the new year, in about February of the new year. But for this holiday period and the new year, I'll be on this slightly altered schedule, and I just wanted to give you the heads up on that. This is also probably a good time to mention that I am going on tour again for the second book in my mystery series. It's titled Loose Lips. It takes place entirely on a boat, so you know there are a ton of Death on the Nile references flying fast and furious in the book, but lots of references to other Christie titles as well, since this is me, after all. I'm very excited for you all to read it, and I would love to see as many of you as possible while I'm out on tour. I won't go through the full rundown now, but starting at the end of January, I will be launching that tour here in Los Angeles. I've got 2 different Los Angeles area events back-to-back in Santa Monica and Pasadena. Those are happening on Tuesday, January 21st at Diesel, a bookstore in Santa Monica, and then Wednesday, January 22nd at Vroman's Bookstore in Pasadena. Then I'll be going to the fabulous Poisoned Pen bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona, for those of you in the Southwest. That is on Monday, January 27th. And then the very next day, I'll be going to Murder by the Book. I'm returning to that wonderful mystery bookstore in Houston, Texas on Tuesday, January 28th. And I'm adding a lot of other dates in places that I haven't been before. I'm going to be doing some events more in the South of the United States, which I was not able to visit when I was promoting The Busybody. So this mystery series, the Ghostwriter Mysteries, is really going strong. I am hard at work on the 3rd book in that series in this current moment. So more to come on that front. And in that, this book series really, truly does come out of my love of Agatha Christie that I nurtured and cultivated right here with Catherine Brobeck and with all of you. I really do think of these books as going hand in hand with the podcast, and I hope you all read them and enjoy them. I've got a link to my author website in the show notes if you want to look up specifics as to tour dates. And like I said, lots more to come very soon. And of course, even if you don't live anywhere near the bookstores I will be visiting on this tour, the important thing is to buy the book, and you can pre-order it right now. So I've provided a link for that purpose as well in the show notes. Let's now get into what we are actually discussing on this episode, which is an original Agatha Christie short story, not yet covered on this podcast. Oh, happy day. I will be discussing Within a Wall by Agatha Christie, and I am discussing it with my good friend, Dr. Michelle Kazmer, who has been on the podcast before. Michelle is going to come on the episode a little later. Before I break things down, I want to give you all a word on spoilers. In addition to our titular tale, the following titles are spoiled in this episode. Some of them barely, some of them thoroughly. Dumb Witness, Evil Under the Sun, 5 Little Pigs, Giant's Bread, The Hollow, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, The Murder at the Vicarage, and 3-Act Tragedy. Okay, let's get into our breakdown here. I'll start with the publication history of Within a Wall. It was first published in the Royal Magazine in October of 1925, early Christie short story here. It was subsequently collected in book form in While the Light Lasts and Other Stories in the UK in 1997. This story went uncollected for 72 years. This is one of those little oddities that friend of the podcast, Tony Medawer, Agatha Christie expert extraordinaire, he edited this collection. He pulled all these different Agatha Christie stories together that had not been collected before. And we should all be grateful to him that he did so, because I think the stories in While the Light Lasts are some of her most fascinating. And it's always so interesting to me to see how these rather unusual, or at least outside the mystery box, if you will, stories still contain so many echoes of what Christie did in her more recognizable mysteries. So that's where we have Within a Wall in the UK. And then in the US, it was also collected in the same year in the Harlequin Tea Set and Other Stories. That book also came out in 1997. Okay, let's talk plot. I'm not going to do my usual mystery breakdown here because, as I just mentioned, this is not a usual mystery. What I'm going to do is a linear and rather bare bones plot summary just to situate the conversation Michelle and I are going to have about the story. That conversation really is the heart of the episode, and I'm eager to get to it as soon as possible. This is one of Christie's more Mary Westmacott-ish stories. There is no murder in this story, alas. No murder of a person, I should say, although we just may have the murder of at least one person's dreams. This is more of a story about relationships, about the way people treat each other, especially people who are in love with each other or who at least believe they are in love with each other. We may even have a character who doesn't quite realize who he's really in love with. It's all a bit muddled, but in the best of ways, because Christie delights in this sort of emotional intrigue, especially when she's writing in the style of Mary Westmacott. And just to comment for a moment before I start the plot summary on reference points to other Christie stories that felt very obvious to me while I was reading this one. In that Within a Wall centers on a famous, or soon-to-be famous, painter, you'd think the Christie novel it most reminded me of would be our beloved Five Little Pigs. And there definitely are echoes of Five Little Pigs here. Michelle and I will absolutely get into that. But actually, the novel it brought to mind more than any other was Giant's Bread, which was Christie's first Mary Westmacott novel, in which she chronicled the origins of a musician's career, what it was that turned this man into the genius composer he became. Giant's Bread was published in 1930, so she must have been thinking about it soon after she wrote this story. And I think what we have in this story is sort of the inverse of Giant's Bread, i.e., what it was that destroyed the career of this promising young genius artiste. Oh my, I seem to have spoiled things, but that's okay. I wanted to point all this out up front just to put you on notice that we really are in one of those odd little corners of the Christieverse here with this story, but I am beyond happy to explore that odd little corner with you all. So let's do it. We open on a Mrs. Lempriere, who I like to think of as Joan West, née Joyce Lempriere's socialite aunt. She is certainly well connected in the art world, and Joyce was an artist, so it kind of tracks. Anyway, we learn that Mrs. Lempriere is the sort of busybody who always manages to ferret out information that the person in question would rather keep hidden. And we're told by an as yet unidentified narrator that she did just this while having tea one day in the studio of the artist Alan Everard. And what was it she discovered? The existence of someone named Jane Haworth, whose name means nothing to us as yet. But our unidentified narrator assumes we do know exactly who Alan Everard is. We're told that two of his early paintings, Color and The Connoisseur, were recently purchased by the nation, which I take to mean that they will be displayed prominently among other fine works by fellow English artists in a national museum. In other words, Alan Everard is in the big leagues. He's a major artist, a genius. Since then, we're told early here in the story, he's become a fashionable portrait painter. But this story dates back to his early period when he was just coming into his own. At this point in his career, where the story begins, he's already painted Color, one of those two early paintings that's so celebrated now, and two other well-regarded pieces, all of them avant-garde or at least highly stylized and personal to him. We get some more information from our chatty narrator. We learn that this tea has been organized by Alan Everard's wife, a former Uber socialite named Isobel Loring, who is such a strong personality that even after her marriage to Everard, she is still known as Isobel Loring. No one calls her Isobel Everard. They just keep on referring to her as Isobel Loring. I love that detail. Basically, Isobel could have married anyone she wanted. She had landed, quote, the heir to a dukedom, a rising politician, and a South African millionaire, end quote, in her second debutante season alone. But to everyone's surprise, she chose the struggling artist Alan Everard, who very quickly became the sought-after artist Alan Everard after he did that painting Color. And if you're wondering what it was a painting of, I will just briefly describe it here. Michelle and I get into it in more detail in our conversation following this summary, but Color depicts a navvy, which is to say an unskilled laborer. I should note this word is stuck in its time. Some would consider it an offensive word nowadays. That's not the only element of this story stuck in its time, which Michelle and I will also discuss. But to get back to this painting, Color, this laborer is depicted amid a landscape of riotous color. And people argue over what it symbolizes. Alan Everard himself is like, I don't know, I just painted what I wanted to paint. But we get the sense through Christie's description of these early paintings that he's an unusual and evocative artist. It seems that Isobel Loring knows a winner when she sees one, and she has yoked herself to the right man. And not just yoked. Let's not undersell Isobel Loring. She's doing what she can to put her husband forward here, which is why she hosts these gatherings during which the cognoscenti, or cognoscenti, if you want to be all fancy in your pronunciation of that word, during which those in the know can come check out his latest work. And what is the latest piece being ogled? A portrait of Isobel, of course. But here's the catch. The portrait of Isobel is a dud. Alan Everard has painted her in excruciating detail, but the effect is a lifeless reproduction, one that doesn't capture the essence of much of anything. We hear this from the lips of Mrs. Lempriere herself, who our narrator says is one of the most intelligent art critics I know. And we get the sense that this well-connected narrator knows a lot of art critics. We do, at this point, finally get a name for our narrator. Mrs. Lempriere calls him Georgie. And it's true, he is very much within the social circle of Alan Everard and his wife Isobel, and as such, he is in a place to tell us the story that now unfolds among Alan Everard, his wife Isobel, and this woman named Jane Haworth. And I love this, but Georgie even gives us his bona fides at one point as a narrator, telling us that he met Jane Haworth twice. He heard details of her life from one of her most intimate friends. He spoke directly to Alan Everard as well. It seems that Georgie wants to contradict some of the stories that the pesky Mrs. Lempriere is busily spreading abroad about these people. He wants to set the record straight. And before launching into this story within a story, he tells us by way of narration, I'm quoting here from the text, "Call some of my story invention if you will. It is not far from the truth." I do just have to point out that Georgie reminded me of Mr. Satterthwaite more than any other Christie character. He seems to be equally well-connected and observant and interested in learning the intimate details of other people's lives. And here is that story that Georgie tells in a nutshell that Michelle and I will be smashing to smithereens in just a moment, inspecting every little thing about this story with obsessive attention to detail. But for now, here are the major plot points of the story. There is another portrait in Alan Everard's studio that Mrs. Lempriere unearths at this gathering. She is exhibiting here, again, her uncanny ability to ferret out that which people do not want exposed to the light of day. The portrait is of a woman no one knows. And this painting, even though it's unfinished, is as alive and exquisite as the portrait of Isobel Loring is dead and dull. We learn that it's a portrait of a woman named Jane Haworth, who is an old friend of Alan's, who doesn't come to these parties, but who is close enough to the family to be the godmother to Alan and Isobel's 5-year-old daughter, Winnie. After the party, it's Isobel who encourages Alan to see Jane, who he apparently hasn't seen for quite some time. So Alan goes to visit her, and Jane lives at the top of a block of mansion flats overlooking Battersea Park. She is obviously not well off. And yet, it becomes clear that Isobel has been appealing to Jane for help, not only in the form of the occasional minding of Winnie, sometimes she watches the child, but also in the form of money that she says is for Winnie, for clothes, for education, etc. And so here we have ye old love triangle in a Christie story. 2 women, 1 man. And here, the 2 women could not be more unlike each other, especially in their effect on Alan. Isobel is beautiful and perfect-looking and fascinating, but there is a stillness to her, an inertia that attracts and soothes Alan, but which does nothing to stir his creative juices. Jane is the opposite. She irritates Alan. He wishes she lived in a better flat and that she didn't insist on employing a drunk woman as her maid or displaying bad art or ugly photos of babies that friends of hers have given to her. And he really wishes that Jane wasn't so easily manipulated by Isobel. In one way, Jane is incredibly weak-willed, but in another, there is a strength and a reserve and an integrity to her. She's extremely contradictory and hard to get at, whereas Isobel is precisely who she says she is. So, two very different women, and Alan has made his choice between them, right? Or has he? Because off his latest interaction with Jane, he is inspired to paint something new, something really good, unlike that painting of Isobel, which he does finally admit to Jane is terrible. Of course he knows it's terrible. This new painting is The Connoisseur, the second painting mentioned at the start of the story as the two masterpieces of Alan Everard's that the nation has bought. Jane loves the new painting, and Alan is pleased. And now that he's done with his project, he comes back down to earth, as artists do. He's not consumed by his creation anymore, and he notices a few mundane matters, like the fact that his daughter Winnie is basically dressed in rags, even though poor Jane, and I do mean poor in the financial sense, has been funneling hundreds of pounds to Isobel, supposedly for Winnie's upkeep. But these women both know who that cash is really for. And after a little bit of prying into Isobel's passbook, where she keeps a record of her finances, Alan knows too. He realizes that Isobel is sucking Jane dry for her own selfish purposes. And soon after this realization, Jane dies of influenza followed by pneumonia. I suppose if we really want to, we could theorize that Isobel brought about Jane's death by impoverishing Jane, but I think that's a stretch. It's an indirect link at best, and Jane also knew exactly what was happening and what she was doing when she was giving that money to Isobel. And on that note of Jane knowing exactly what she was doing, in the papers that she leaves behind her, which she has directed Alan Everard to read, she has appointed him her executor. Jane admits simply and frankly to Alan that she was always in love with him. And Alan realizes that Jane was the inspiration behind all his paintings, not just the inspiration, but the source of them. Even when he was painting all these odd figures and odd landscapes, or a cubist rendering of a famous scientist, Sir Rufus Hirschman, he was really painting Jane. He was responding to the way that she made him feel. And now Jane is gone, and all he has left is Isobel, who reminds him of a riddle that his daughter Winnie asks him one day, and here is where we get the title of our piece. The riddle is as follows. Within a wall as white as milk, within a curtain soft as silk, bathed in a sea of crystal clear, a golden apple doth appear. The riddle is, what the heck is this? And the answer is an egg. But Alan says it's Isobel, because this is a perfect description of what Isobel does. She encloses him. She contains him. He is a kept man where Isobel is concerned, because all she wants from him is money and status. Isobel doesn't care about his paintings the way Jane did. Isobel is not alive the way Jane was. And yes, Jane is described at one point in the story as the most alive person Alan had ever met. It's not spelled out, but perhaps the reason Isobel's portrait was so dull and lifeless with nothing beneath the surface is that there's not much beneath the surface where the woman herself is concerned. I think the situation here is more complicated than that, especially given the fact that our narrator, Georgie, never mentions that he spoke to Isobel directly. He spoke to Alan, he spoke to Jane, he spoke to Jane's intimate friend, but never Isobel. Michelle and I will talk a whole lot about that in just a moment. But in any case, Alan puts out the two portraits in his studio of Jane and Isobel, and the difference is so stark, so obvious to him now. But it doesn't matter. Jane is gone, and Isobel has him all to herself now. And as we depart at the end of our story from Alan and Isobel, her hands are around his neck, and she is keeping him wrapped up tight. And here is the last devastating line from the story. The light faded from Jane's picture. The end. But you know what? Not quite the end, because there was a second piece of information folded ever so deftly into this story that I need to highlight before I close out my summary. While Georgie was giving his bona fides about who he knows and who he talked to in the cobbling together of this tale of woe, he makes a point of justifying the telling of this intimate story. He says that Mrs. Lempriere is spreading her version of events, but he also gives another reason, which is that 2 of the 3 major players in this story are dead. Not just Jane Haworth, but Ellen Everard. And this tracks because even though we've learned that Everard went on to be this in-demand portrait painter, how long could he have really lasted in this fashion? Or as a fashion, I guess I should say. So in the same way, Isobel kind of sort of might have murdered Jane. Maybe she murdered not just Alan's dreams, but Alan himself. I find this murder much easier to swallow for reasons Michelle and I will discuss, so perhaps I should have structured this as a murder mystery after all, even though we have 3 characters and 2 of them are victims. So it's not really much of a mystery, but hey, we've even got a clue or 2, which is something that Michelle and I will get into a whole lot more in the second part of this episode, coming to you right now, after this brief message, that is. Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
It is a joy to be speaking once again with Dr. Michelle Kazmer, who I had on while covering the podcast's final Parker Pine short story, The Brigada Mystery. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Kemper. It is an absolute delight to be back.
So I actually had to look this up, and believe it or not, it's been nearly 2 years since our Parker Pine episode aired at the end of 2022. I think it feels like yesterday because you have been such a steadfast friend of the podcast and of mine in the years intervening. And just as a refresher for listeners, Michelle is the Dean of the College of Communication and Information and professor in the School of Information at Florida State University. And we spoke at some length in our previous episode about how she uses an information systems approach in her scholarly work on Agatha Christie. Today, however, I want to jump right into a discussion of this story because Michelle reached out to me, as she does, and she let me know that whenever I got around to covering Within a Wall, she would love to be a part of the discussion because it just so happens to be her favorite short story of Agatha Christie's. And for an agathologist as meticulous and devoted as Michelle is, that is really saying something. So Michelle, I will start with the obvious question here. Why is Within a Wall your favorite Agatha Christie short story?
Thank you for asking, right? Because that's a big assertion. I mean, that's a lot of really brilliant short stories by an extraordinary author to say that this is your absolute favorite. And
I was shocked when you wrote that.
There are a lot of really good stories, don't get me wrong. But part of it is, I think, a personal weakness on my part. I adore a framed story. I am an absolute sucker for a framed story. And I think this one works so incredibly well. Without the frame, it's still a pretty nice little romance story with some really deep and nuanced explorations of love, which Agatha Christie deals with throughout the canon, as well as art and gender. But with the frame, it just becomes so deeply, deeply brilliant. I still remember the first time I read it, right? I was in the US, so I went and bought the Harlequin tea set paperback. It's actually still in my hand as we speak. Mm-hmm. I was a graduate student. I didn't have any money. Like, I didn't buy new books back at that time. I actually went to the bookstore and paid full price for this collection because I was so excited to get it. And I sat down, of course, read the whole thing straight through and just kept coming back to this story, both because of those really big concepts that I think are dealt with in a really extraordinary way, but also just because I do like a framed story.
So, what is it about the framed story that fascinates you? And is it something that Christie has done elsewhere? Because I think one of my favorite things about this story is how many echoes of other Christie stories we can see in it. I love personally when you can almost see her, especially in an early short story like this. This is from 1925. That was when it was first published. You can see her almost honing her skills as to just the craft of writing itself, but also thematically, tonally. And I think we can see so much of that in this story. But I'll be honest with you, most of the echoes that I found and that I enjoyed didn't really have to do with the frame. So I'm curious about your frame specific thoughts here.
Well, that's the other thing, right? I mean, she didn't do the framed story an awful lot. Now, there are some where they're semi-framed, and I think, obviously, I think the novel that you put closest in mind, at least to me, when I read this short story, is Five Little Pigs.
Sure.
And so, in some of those retrospective novels, in particular, they come very close to being framed because the person comes and talks to Poirot in the present day. And then we experience the story, even when we're experiencing it through explicit looks back, as opposed to being moved temporally into the timing of the story, it still really works effectively as a framed story. But this one here, there are characters in the frame that are just absolutely incredible. And what I wrote down about the story, right? The only mystery here is left unsolved. And really the only mysteries, plural, here are left unsolved. But the narrator himself, who really only comes out in the frame, one of the most important characters, Mrs. Lempriere, who only shows up in the frame itself.
Yep.
And they're such amazing characters, and it leaves you with so many important things to think about, and the way they did and didn't interact with the characters who actually appear in the main part of the story.
Right, because we do get a name for the narrator, right? Georgie,
yeah.
Mrs. Lempriere is the one who calls him Georgie. When I finished this story before we were going to discuss it, I ended up reading it several times. But the first time that I finished it, the character from sort of classic literature who first came to mind was Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby.
Absolutely. Yep,
right?
Yep.
And I was like, and I was very proud of myself because I was like, I think that's the same year. And just funnily enough, I mean, The Great Gatsby also was published in 1925. But, that is, I mean, I think it's actually, I think some people will be surprised to hear you talk about the framing aspect of the story being what you love about this Agatha Christie short story, because people don't often speak about Christie in that way. But I think just translate that or put that sort of analysis onto the way that people tend to interact with The Great Gatsby. And it's a lot more comfortable because I think people talk ad nauseum about the framing device in The Great Gatsby and how key that is to what Fitzgerald is doing. If you didn't have the framing device of The Great Gatsby, the book would not be the classic or the masterpiece that it is. And there's definitely something similar going on here, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And of course, I mean, the other, in the US, the other framed story that people really tend to encounter in high school English when you're learning about the framed story is Ethan Frome.
Sure.
Right. And of course, this one has pretty much nothing in common with Ethan Frome. Well, although the love triangle, but you could argue in some ways is a little bit similar.
There's a love triangle in both. Yes. I mean, Ethan Frome. I think I had to slog my way through Ethan Frome at some point in high school. And I love me some Edith Wharton, actually. Like, don't get me wrong. It's just that is not my preferred story.
I know. You know what? I'm the only person, just like I'm apparently the only person who thinks Within a Wall is my favorite Agatha Christie short story. I'm also, I think, the only person in the world who had to read Ethan Frome and then loved it. So we'll take that for what it's worth.
Let's talk about Georgie and Mrs. Lempriere. I mean, what's interesting is Georgie at one point, before he goes into a real kind of explication as to the intricacies of the interpersonal relationships here among Jane and Alan Everard and his wife Isobel, he almost gives his bona fides, right? Where he's like, well, I spoke with Jane twice. I spoke with an intimate friend of hers as well. And I also spoke with Alan Everard many times. And it's interesting that Christie does that, because I think it seems to almost be an attempt to put the reader at ease as to, well, what he's going to tell you, he is telling you with authority, but it's a double-edged sword because it's also making you very much aware of the fact that this person is telling you a story right now. This character in the short story is now spinning a yarn within it, right?
Oh, absolutely. Well, and in fact, I would say, and there are a couple of things to piece together about even the parts that you just said, right? Because he says that Mrs. L is the one who found Jane, who discovered Jane, right? Which means that at the time of the tea party, as far as we can tell, Georgie hadn't met Jane.
Yep.
And if you read throughout the story, she dies kind of not that long afterward. There's not a huge amount of time that passes. And how he managed to meet her and managed to have two conversations with her that were so self-revelatory is kind of incredible. As is the fact that he talked to Alan Everard about Jane when we know that Alan didn't like to talk about Jane at all.
Right.
Right. And so there's already this kind of oddness. But of course, Georgie himself in the first paragraph signals that he's an unreliable narrator. Right. Because this first thing, when you get to the end of the first paragraph and he's talking about Mrs. L and he introduces her and he says, it is always an accident when she reveals the thing that you don't want to be revealed. Well, of course, we know it's not an accident. He knows we know it's not an accident. So he's already demonstrating that he is willing to communicate with us in a way that is not absolutely straightforward.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of irony in his voice from the very beginning and distance. It really is true. I mean, there are so many more straightforward ways that Christie could have chosen to tell the story of this artist and his wife and this other woman. I think the story is as good as it is because that internal story that we're only getting through the filter of Georgie is fascinating, right? Mm-hmm. And it's sort of touching on so many of the themes and the tropes that Christie clearly was just personally obsessed by and loved to explore herself. So I think for anyone who loves Five Little Pigs or any of the other full-length novels that hinge on a love triangle, you're going to see so many echoes of those novels in that internal story. But she could have chosen to tell that story in a much more straightforward way. And the fact that she uses Georgie, that she's telling it at a distance with this irony and with this filter, to me, it almost makes the internal story itself, I don't want to say more intimate, but like more personally felt or like more experienced to me. Like I feel like I'm getting a look in because I know that it's being filtered through someone else. And I know that this is something that is extremely personal and almost secret and that I shouldn't be looking at. So it's almost this like heightened sense of the intimacy among these three people, if that makes sense. Am I making any sense?
It absolutely makes sense. And also I would add to that is that the fact that you've spent a few pages getting to know Georgie before he starts telling you this other story, that also enhances that sense of intimacy that you have, right? If you just started this story where the story starts and you were just hearing from an unnamed omniscient narrator who was just telling you what was happening, again, it would take you a few pages to get in and you would decide or not how trustworthy you felt the omniscient narrator to be. But in this case, you've actually spent a few pages. You've gotten to know this person. You've gotten to know that they use irony. You've been explicitly told in a couple of ways that they're unreliable. And in fact, that's what I absolutely love. I mean, the transition from the end of the frame to the story here, I mean, you get this really powerful kind of 1-2, right? Where he explicitly tells you that he's going to be an unreliable narrator, where he says, call it some of my story invention, if you will. It is not far from the truth. That's the last thing he says before you launch into the story. But in addition, you've just been whacked by the fact that now that they are both dead, right? So you go in at this point, you've been hearing about Jane and Isobel and Alan and Mrs. Lempriere and Georgie, and you're kind of going into this whole thing. And one of the last things he says directly to you is, now that they are both dead. Yeah. And you're like, oh, because at that point, you're like, wait, okay, so I get that. And then you get to the end of the story and you're like, okay, wait, so I get that Jane has died. But what happened to Alan Everard? And that's where I said a few minutes ago, right? The only mystery here is left unsolved because we don't know.
Well, so two things. I want to point out that I think Christie is doing something here that she does so well throughout her career, which is that she's creating a story that can be appreciated on two levels. Because that phrase, "it is not far from the truth," is so masterful. It's so well used, because if you are choosing to read the story and not focus on the framing and like not really think about, the irony or the distance of this narrator, and you just sort of then zip right along and you appreciate this internal story that Georgie is spinning, you can do that. And I think that to say it is not far from the truth gives that kind of a reader the comfort of, okay, like, no, so now he's going to tell me what happened. But with that exact same phrase, she's also telling you it's not the truth, or at the very least, that truth is complicated, right? That telling exactly how something happened perhaps is impossible because we all have our own points of view, say, and to be able to sort of speak to both of those types of readers, to the reader who's going to focus on the framing device and really kind of, dig in and be like, okay, what is going on here? Sort of in a Great Gatsby-ish kind of a way. And also then have the story, though, work completely for a reader who might do, I don't even want to call it, a cursory or a quick read. It's just different. It's just, it's a different way to read it for a different reason almost, is fantastic. And like, that is something that Christie does that, Fitzgerald wasn't doing. And it creates that awkwardness of, I think, sometimes some people, when Christie starts getting analyzed in, let's just say, that Fitzgeraldian way with the story, they're like, really? Should you really be doing that? And I just want to point that out and use that textual evidence of that half a sentence to say yes, 100% yes, because she's doing the work here to create that kind of a story while simultaneously having given a different kind of a story to someone who isn't interested in that kind of a story, but wants something that's a little more quote unquote genre. And I'm using the biggest, most vigorous air quotes there, because obviously we can read genre as Fitzgerald. That's fine. But I know you know what I'm saying. I hope that everyone else knows what I'm saying.
Sure, they do. Well, and as you point out here, right? I mean, one of the things that we know about Christie is that, so many times in the past, the reason that people have kind of undersold the brilliance and the depth that she brings to writing is the fact that she's able to be so parsimonious. And, we have just focused on, one sentence there, it is not far from the truth, which is huge. But there are two other beautiful examples of the way she does things very parsimoniously in this story. Do you want me to go ahead?
Please. Yes. Are you about to cite from the text? Please do so.
May I? Right. So one is where we finally meet Jane in the flat. We've gotten into Jane's flat. And there are several things to say about the experience that Alan has going to Jane's flat. One of the times that we actually get to see him do that, the one where he actually interacts with her. But the interaction that he has with her about the vase that she gets from Miss Bates, the painted rose vase from Margate,
yes,
is so spectacular. It's so brief. It's kinetic. It's perceptive. You can see the vase. You can feel it. You can feel that experience of Miss Bates coming back with this vase for Jane, and Jane's reaction to her, and where she says, it must have cost her quite a lot for her, and she thought, I'd be so pleased. I simply had to put it in a good place. And you kind of know everything you need to know about Jane at that point.
Oh my God. It's like one of the best examples of show, don't tell, right? She, within a paragraph, exactly the kind of person who Jane is. And how much more powerful is that than saying, Jane was good, Jane was kind, Jane was generous. She's not telling you any of that, but it's a very moving, poignant, and memorable moment. And I agree with you. I mean, you can see it. I feel like there's a little bit of a Winky Emma reference in there. I mean, I love that she used the name Miss Bates. Like, I don't know if that is totally a coincidence, since Miss Bates in Emma is very much that kind of a character also, like the person who is fallen on hard times and interacts with people who are more wealthy than she, and is constantly trying to sort of be on their level, or at least retain some of the former dignity that she had when she had more money. I love that too. I mean, Christie, I think as a well-read person, she just couldn't help herself. Sometimes I think she just had to, we see all those Dickens and Thackeray references that she would constantly pepper in the novels. And I feel like she just couldn't help herself here. She had to call her Miss Bates. But it's a great moment. I mean, that was one of the many passages I bracketed as I was reading.
Absolutely. And I mean, yeah, it comes hard on the heels of you have the experience of her with her daily woman and why she keeps her despite the issues that she has, and how she also has all the pictures of babies on her wall, even though babies are not necessarily very photogenic and they're certainly not her children.
Right.
But it shows us too, and I think this is really important about Jane, it shows us that her own social circle is actually much broader than Ellen Everard. And I think that's really important to the story. I think if you read this story and you think of Jane as sitting in her flat by herself with no other social circle to count on or interact with, and you imagine therefore her kind of feeding all of herself into this obsession with Alan, I think it reads very differently from if you know that she has lots of other people in her life that she is trying to nurture.
Absolutely. Yeah.
As opposed to Isobel.
As opposed to Isobel, who is, especially in the framing story, I mean, for the most part, Isobel is really, we only really get to know her in the framing story. She's introduced at this fairly grand gathering, right? Where people such as Mrs. Lempriere, who has this great insight into art, and Georgie, our well-connected narrator, they're all looking at this portrait that has been painted by Everard of Isobel, and she's put out there by Georgie as someone with a vast acquaintance and this social know-how, right? She was the talk of the town when she was a debutante. She was by far, the debutante who everyone wanted to marry. And then she surprised everyone by marrying this pretty much penniless at the time artist, or at least unknown artist. But then it turned out that, her instincts didn't fail her, because he turned into Alan Everard and he became this great celebrated artist. That's all there on the page, but I think between that depiction and then this show don't tell depiction that we get in the internal story of Jane Haworth, that this is such a contrast. There's something so small, actually, about Isobel's world, and confined and constrictive. And she manages to do that all within, right, a framing story in Georgie's voice, and then an internal story that's supposedly told by Georgie. I'm not even really sure exactly how she conveys that, but I certainly finished the story, and that was my impression.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think you might even say confined, perhaps within a wall, like an egg. I'll just leave that there. But what I like about that too is that, of course, as I'm reading about Isobel, and she had 3 strings in her bow, an heir to a dukedom, a rising politician, and a South African millionaire, but she marries this struggling unknown painter. And of course, who's the other really famous character in the canon who did something similar? And it's, of all people, Griselda Clement.
Oh, interesting. I did not think of Griselda.
Right? Well, because other than that, Griselda, who actually turns out to be, as far as we know, quite a lovely person, right? She stays married to the vicar, and, and later they go on to have these children, the baby that pushes itself backward on the hearthrug and what have you, right? But, Griselda had a cabinet minister. I looked it up. I didn't have this memorized. A cabinet minister, a baronet, a rich company promoter, 3 subalterns, and a ne'er-do-well with attractive manners. After her, she decided to marry the vicar. And yeah, I couldn't help but think of Griselda when I read that particular description of the opportunities that Isobel had available to her before she chose to marry Alan Everard. Although, of course, mostly I was thinking about the Crails.
Yeah, I was mostly thinking about the Crails too. I mean, I think that it's such a fun exercise, and someone actually recently suggested to me that I should do an episode that's just focusing on love triangles, perhaps even trying to rank the love triangles of Agatha Christie. I'm not sure that I could even do that, but maybe I will. I think that what's so interesting to me is that it's almost like Five Little Pigs is the sort of inverse where the women are concerned of this story, because at least as I read it, we have a wife who is the more superficial, empty, ultimately empty person, and the quote unquote other woman. It's actually very insulting to Jane to call her the other woman. She's not really the other woman, but she's the other woman within this triangle here that we're analyzing. she is the one with all the substance. She is the one who is more alive than other people. Christie, goes to that well of calling people particularly alive. It made me think of Egg, speaking of eggs from
yes,
from Three Act Tragedy. But she uses it even more than that. I think most notably, though, with Egg in Three Act Tragedy, she flips it, right? In Five Little Pigs. And it's really Caroline Crail who has all of that insight and understanding and generosity, which, is even part of the solving of the mystery, is that you realize that even extends to Elsa Greer, right? That she feels bad for Elsa Greer. And it's Elsa who is in important ways shallow and unwilling to see beyond her own self-interests. And you just have a flipping of that here, which I think is really interesting. It's so interesting to read this story in parallel to, or to think about it in parallel to Five Little Pigs on a lot of different levels and in a lot of different ways.
Right. Let me pause to talk about love triangles, and then let me come back to Five Little Pigs. Right. So I said this at the conference. Was that just last year? Maybe. That I really think that you're hard pressed to find anything that Agatha Christie wrote that doesn't have a love triangle in it of some kind.
Right. Yeah.
So when you start to try to rank them, or you start to try to say, oh, well, that work doesn't have a love triangle. Well, you immediately have to start to qualify. You say, well, there is one,
but it's not central or as important. Yeah.
But it's not central, or it involves a dog, or it's not romantic love. You know what I mean? I wasn't saying that. I mean, I was saying it's not romantic love, but I think you're very, very hard pressed. Now, occasionally you will find a polynomial figure that is more than a triangle. I mean, sometimes you have,
right.
Kind of a quadrilateral or even larger figure. But I did just want to say, I think if you start trying to rank the love triangles, you run the risk of, at the very least, getting another one of those emails from me. Which is the what about Dear Henry Footed. I was so glad that Dear Henry Footed made it into your dogs episode, because that was one that I'd forgotten about, and that's just mortifying to me because he's such a great character. But coming back to Five Little Pigs. Now remember, Five Little Pigs has always been my favorite Agatha Christie novel before it turned up number one in the rankings. I'm going to stand on the courage of my convictions, even when eventually there's a backlash and nobody likes it anymore. It will still be my favorite. But one of the things that I wrote down here, I said, when what we see is Within a Wall is, what happens if Amy S. Crail is married to Elsa Greer in this marriage to Isobel. But at one point later, I also wrote, and in some ways, Isobel is a type, really. She's what people think Arlena Stewart Marshall is in some ways, and what Philip Blake thinks Caroline Crail is in other ways.
Can you tease that out a little bit? I think
I can try, right? Because people perceive that Arlena Marshall is this Arlena Stewart Marshall, right? Is this femme fatale, right? That she's this successful, beautiful woman who can be very, very still. And I think, that stillness of Isabel's is really what comes out here, who can be very, very still and just sort of magnetically attract a man toward her on the beach. That's one of the first times we see her. And of course, we find out later that she's not that in any way, shape, or form.
Sure.
Right. And in fact, it was the machinations of the other character in that scene that was drawing him to her. Right. And the same thing, right? I mean, Caroline Crail, many people have different thoughts about Caroline Crail in Five Little Pigs, but Philip Blake, I think, really perceives her to be affecting Amias in a lot of the same ways that Isobel Loring is affecting Alan Everard in this story, that she's actually not good for him. That she wants him to do certain things. She wants him to be successful and doesn't really care about him and his happiness as a man.
Yep.
So anyway, both of those are not necessarily factual reads, but there they are.
No, I agree with you. And I think so. I wanted to touch on this. There's definitely the sense conveyed in the story, right, that Everard's portrait of his wife, of Isobel, has no life in it because Isobel has no real life in her, right? He even late in the story, it takes a while for Everard to get to the point where he's honest about his painting, because for a while he's just like, it's the best thing I ever did. It's the best thing I ever did. And he's clearly trying to convince himself, or at least others, of that, because everyone knows it's not true. And he describes the painting as having, quote, nothing behind, nothing but surface, damned smooth surface. And on one level, it feels like that is absolutely how we're meant to see Isobel. And I think, to your point, that's sort of how, not exactly, but that's sort of how Philip Blake perhaps would describe Caroline Crail, that she doesn't have the right substance. And I think that we can accept that, but we can also question it. And I would bring into the conversation yet another Agatha Christie work, which is probably the one that I thought of almost as much as Five Little Pigs, if not as much as, which is a Mary Westmacott title. And that would be Giant's Bread. Sure. And Giant's Bread was published in 1930. It's the first Mary Westmacott. So given these dates here, 1925 and 1930, I don't think it's a stretch to argue, even though this is always just theorizing, that in some ways, I feel like Within a Wall is the short story version of what became Giant's Bread, because I think she's doing so many similar things in Giant's Bread. But crucially, I think what's so interesting, if you compare those two stories, Nell in Giant's Bread is the Isobel character. And she has a lot of those same qualities. She's beautiful. She's quiet. She's entrancing. She gets, this high society man who's all over her and wants to marry her. And her mother is very much a Mrs. Bennet type who's constantly just wants her daughter to marry to the highest bidder. But there is so much more to Nell. Actually, the questioning happens within the novel of Giant's Bread in a way that I think Christie is letting the reader make the decision to question it here in the short story. She's saying you can do that if you want to. That's sort of if you want to take that deeper read. In Giant's Bread, I think she really goes into that, and it's part of the full length novel and that's often what she did, right? When she would have a short story where she was like, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. Maybe I can plumb the depths of those characters a little bit more. It feels to me, again, total theorizing here. I'm not basing this on anything other than just having read both of these stories, but it feels like there's a little bit of that going on. And I completely agree with you. I think that Isobel is portrayed in a pretty static and specific way in this story, but given the framing device, we're welcomed, I think, to question that. And if you read Giant's Bread as almost a companion piece, and I think it's pretty obvious the parallels there between Isobel and Nell, I think we can see some of that questioning happening within the story itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. A kind of an insistence on there is more here. I also had written down two other characters in the canon who came to mind.
Please.
When I was reading Isobel. As I read Isobel, what continues to strike me is the way that she reads as snake-like in the descriptions. And Agatha Christie has been willing to use the word snake-like, or certainly the word sinuous, with respect to other women characters elsewhere in the canon. She doesn't use it with respect to Isobel at all. But she has this stillness where she sort of fixes you with her glance in a way that really made me feel that way. And that
like a cobra.
that absolute utter stillness that put me in mind, both of Morel from The Mystery of the Blue Train and Nadina from The Man in the Brown Suit.
Oh, interesting.
And the effect that they had or tried to have on the men around them. So I had a couple of things that I thought about Isobel, one of which is that I actually wrote this down. I'm really hard pressed to picture, I don't mean in a detailed way, but just in general, Isobel Loring giving birth to a baby, right? It just feels so completely antithetical to who she is as a person. And yet she's got this, they have this child.
Yeah, Winnie. Yeah, I think she's 5, right?
She's 5. And, to go back to Five Little Pigs, the line in Five Little Pigs is Carla is not given her full representational value, is what Poirot says when he's asking Miss Williams about her later. He's like, why are people not really thinking about this child in her full representational value? And I think in a lot of ways we see that with Winnie, in part because we get to know a little bit about her personality, actually, and we get to know a little bit more about Winnie's personality as she is at 5 than we got to know about Carla Le Marchand and what she was like when she was small, when the actual murder took place, right? We know that Winnie has this sense of whimsy, this sense of fun, right? Because she comes and asks this riddle of her father. And when she gives her an answer that we all know is really relevant to the story, but that seems to her to be kind of a non sequitur, she goes off in peals of laughter. And we also know about Winnie that she doesn't seem to care what she's wearing.
Right.
Even if all the people around her really do. But other than that, it's just so absolutely horrifying the way she's used as a tool
for money. Yeah.
for money.
She's basically, her mother is using her as the excuse to ask Jane, who doesn't have, and that's made very clear that she doesn't have that much money herself. And the word is used, denuding herself, which is really interesting, stripping away the little that she has for this family, essentially, not just for Winnie. It would be one thing, I suppose, if it really was clothes for Winnie, and because this mother couldn't adequately, feed and clothe her child. But we know that's not the case at all, that even, Winnie is in rags because all the money is going to Isobel. That's at least what we're supposed to think.
Well, right, exactly. And what you just said about Jane actually reminded me. Remember, a while ago, I said there were these other two bits of places in this story where Agatha Christie was really parsimonious in the way she wrote things.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so it took me a while to get back to the second one now, which you just made me think of, which also has to do with that language about Jane giving up, like you said, denuding herself, is this beautiful, almost Roger Ackroyd-esque span of text across two paragraphs, where there's one paragraph that ends, Isobel was calm and reassuring. Of course, she wouldn't let Jane spend more than she could afford. There's a paragraph break, and the next paragraph starts, a month later, Jane died. Right? Because, of course, she winds up spending literally her life, which apparently is what she could afford and what she really, in some ways, what she chose to afford.
Yeah. The ultimate generosity. That's basically the giving tree. There's like a little bit of giving tree in there, right? It's like, and then the tree was happy. I feel like this is something that comes up, especially among parents sometimes, because most people of a certain age were given the giving tree, at least here in the US, to read when they were younger. And I don't think that happens anymore because the message of just ultimate sacrifice of the giving tree. It's a pretty clear message of just give and give and give and give and give until you die. And well, at least you're a really good person. And isn't that what it's all about?
Right.
That's what the giving tree, that's the message in the giving tree, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely it is. And I think, and there has been, and I think a lot of really thoughtful, I wouldn't call it backlash, but thoughtful criticism of that, in particular, the gendered aspects of it as well. And, that's clearly what we see coming out here. But, oh my gosh, there's still so much in this story. Like, I'm like, but I've got.
Yes. No, and that's the thing. Nothing in this story, what you said at the beginning of this conversation, because of the framing device, nothing in this story is straightforward or simple or unable to be refuted, basically. Right. And it's why, though, I want to touch on one thing. And this is me now going back many, many minutes here to something that I said I was going to get to, which is the end of the story. Obviously, the story ends in a deliberately ambiguous, or I would even say vague way, right? Where we're not meant to be totally sure what's happening here. Isobel has embraced her husband, and she writes, the wall was growing up all around him now. The curtain soft as silk, which is a quote from Winnie's dream, which Alan Everard had said reminded him of his wife. The curtain wrapping him round, stifling him a little, but so soft, so sweet. Now they were drifting together at peace out on the crystal sea. The wall was very high now, shutting out all those other things, those dangerous, disturbing things that hurt, that always hurt. Out on the sea of crystal, the golden apple between their hands. And then the final line here in its own paragraph, the light faded from Jane's picture. So I do think that Christie actually layers in a really excellent clue as to what's happening in this story right at the very beginning of the story, which is such textbook classic detective fiction 101. Like, layer your clues in early when the reader isn't paying attention yet, or isn't going to realize how significant something really is. And it happens in the second sentence of the third paragraph of the story. And especially for Christie, who tends to be such a clean and simple prose stylist, much to her and her readers' benefit, this is a very long, elaborate sentence for Christie. It has 7 comma clauses in it. And I think it's the 5th of these 7 clauses that is the significant one. So I'm just going to read out this sentence here. And this is about Alan Everard and his paintings. His two most famous pictures, Color and The Connoisseur, which belonged to his early period, before he became a fashionable portrait painter, were purchased by the nation last year, and for once the choice went unchallenged. So because of that sentence, we do know that before he died, and after the events of this story, Alan Everard did become a fashionable portrait painter. And in the course of the story, he rails against this, right? And Isobel wants him to paint fashionable portraits because they will fetch a lot of money. And she jokes, well, I want a lot of money. And he realizes, ooh, she actually really does. So I would argue that we know from that sentence that Alan Everard gives in to Isobel, and that what we see happening at the end of the story here is Isobel wins. Capitalism wins. The sort of her greed and her own self-interest. This is what happens if Elsa Greer wins, right? And again, it's so interesting. Think about this in parallel to, I'm now cribbing this from what Catherine Brobeck always said, but Catherine Brobeck always maintained that the best of Christie's writing was the final pages of Five Little Pigs, that there was nothing more exquisite that she wrote than those devastating final pages. And I will never forget that image of Elsa Greer putting the rug over her knees and entombing herself in her fancy car, and the car driving away. And it's just so, and again, it's Christie having both ways. She gets away, but of course, no, she doesn't. She's basically dead. And she says that I died. I died when this happened. So that is what happens if Elsa Greer actually ends up with her man, right? What happens at the end of this story? I think that she's giving us the tools to make that assumption, and I think be confident in that. What do you think about that?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely, for sure, right? But we also know a couple of other things. We know that Alan Everard didn't manage to do that forever, because we know he's died by this point, right? So he wasn't able to sustain life doing that. He did it for a while. He was a fashionable portrait painter. And in fact, it's interesting because we can see in his artistic output, right? Color, romance, the portrait of Sir Rufus Hirschman, which you can almost, if you choose to read a lot into it, you can almost imagine at that point that was Isobel kind of starting to make her play, right? That she was like, well, why don't you do this portrait of this famous scientist, right? But he actually manages, through an interaction with Jane, to pull back. Well, so he does the Sir Rufus Hirschman, right? And she's like, okay, so I've managed to kind of make progress on this portrait concept. I know how I can seal the deal from my side. I'll make him paint me. And so he does that next, but he still manages to have this one last artistically motivating interaction with Jane that produces that anger and irritation that he needs in order to produce his great art, right? So he did color, he did romance. He does Sir Rufus Hirschman, which is kind of it's a portrait of a famous rich person, but it's also a piece of his, quote, what I'm calling his real art. And then Isobel's kind of getting her foot in the door with the pink satin portrait. And I love the way they talk about the pink satin and that it's just so absolutely fabulous. Yeah. And then goes back and he has this interaction with Jane where she makes him feel anger and irritation and all of these things that he can't feel with Isobel. And I'm going to come back to that in a second when I say can't feel. And he goes back and he paints the Connoisseur, but then Jane dies twice. Once of pneumonia and then again at the end of the book. And I want to talk a little bit about that more. But while we're touching on the Connoisseur, I hope this is an okay moment to bring this up because I don't want to get through this story without saying it, is that when we talk about the Connoisseur is we do get one of those representations stuck in its time. There's a piece of anti-Semitism in this story, but I want to make sure that I don't gloss over in the description of the Jewish person in the painting The Connoisseur, which of course we don't see any of this art. But I did want to mention that it's in there because it is a jarring moment in otherwise a story that is not problematic in that way. Although I would also say in the description of the painting Color, I don't think it's a particularly great representation to say that he's a magnificent brute beast whose look is without intelligence, without hope, with a dumb, unconscious pleading. There's also certainly a piece of probably classism there that isn't great, but I think the anti-Semitism is worse.
I agree. Yeah, that's in color, right?
Yeah.
First minute. Yeah, agree. I was a little uncomfortable with the description of the navvy.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Yeah. Agree. And I think this is a story that has so many Christie classics in it, and most of them we can delight in. And, because reading Christie is a multifaceted experience, and that's something that we've never shied away from on this podcast, because I want to give a true representation of what it's like to read Christie. I agree. We get one of those, just a soup zone of casual anti-Semitism that's like, ooh, like it's surprising. It's always, for me, unwelcome when you come across it, and it felt in keeping with, depictions that we've seen elsewhere. Yeah, she's describing the connoisseur. The point of the piece seems to be that there are these crass capitalists who pale in comparison, literally pale in comparison to this eternal ageless art that they're bartering over. They're denigrating it by trying to possess it with money. And this bust is, in the light here, and he's going to have the light shining on it. And then this buyer and seller are sort of in relative darkness. And she describes the shopkeeper as follows: behind the counter, a small Jew with cunning eyes. And yes, that is, I think, an unfortunate way to describe it. I will say that the other way in which this story reminded me of Five Little Pigs is that Christie is remarkably good at describing a painting. I mean, yes. I do see these paintings, and I do want to highlight that, because I think I do often criticize Christie for her physical descriptions, because I think sometimes her physical descriptions of people feel a little rote, a little by the numbers. But when it comes to paintings, wow, she is so good. I think there's a lot of paintings here in not that long of a story, and I can see every single one of them. And they're quite different. As you said, I can see the pink satin, that material that he's so meticulously painted. And I can see the colors here and color. And even in this painting here, the connoisseur, she's so good at that. And that's a big part of Five Little Pigs. Five Little Pigs wouldn't be, I think, as effective as it is if she couldn't do that. Right.
Right. Yep. Absolutely. But like you said, so what do we know at the end, right? We know that those two famous pictures, Color and the Connoisseur, were purchased by the nation. And for once, the choice went unchallenged, which is also a very funny piece of, there are so many what I would call pop culture references in this story. In fact, sometimes it's hard to actually keep count of them all. But that said, I wanted to get back to the Jane thing, because I think it's really important. So kind of what I wrote down here is, what we also learn in this interaction is that it is Jane who spurs the necessary emotion in Everard to motivate him to paint his real art. So of course we know that once Jane dies, there's no way for him to do so. That irritation and anger that he gets from Jane, in his heart of hearts, he knows that he needs that. But what I think is really interesting is when he is going through Jane's apartment after she dies, he tries to preserve that anger and irritation, right? Because he finds the letter behind the drawer and he grabs it and he carries it home. And as he's carrying that letter home to Isobel, he's using it to try to feed his anger and irritation. And in fact, he's trying to feed anger and irritation at Isobel, which he's never been able to feel, at least not in a sustained way, right? He tried when he found the passbook and didn't succeed. And now he's got the letter, and he's going to try to hold that anger and irritation against Isobel, because he knows he needs it if he's going to be able to create art again. And he comes home and he's like, okay, I've got the portrait of Jane. I've got this feeling of anger and irritation inside myself. If I can transfer the alive aspect of this anger and irritation into my experience of this portrait of Jane in my home, even though Isobel is here, I will still be able to create art. And Isobel's last genius move is to get him to let go of that anger and irritation, so he's neither feeling it toward her nor toward Jane. And therefore, the final killing of Jane, the light goes out of the portrait, and therefore we know that his ability to create real art is no longer with him.
Yes.
Whew. And you wonder why I love this story so much. I mean, I'm about to burst into tears thinking about it. It's just so incredibly powerful.
It's so powerful. And it's very, I mean, I would almost dare say that for anyone who is a huge fan of Five Little Pigs, and I hope everyone is a huge fan of Five Little Pigs, everyone listening to this podcast, you almost need to read this story as well, because that anger and that irritation and that passion, that's the Krells, right? Like we realize at the end of the story, that's the flip that happens where you're like, oh my God, this wasn't a marriage on the rocks. This was a marriage that was thriving because these people, they loved each other and they felt for each other and they cared so much about each other. And Caroline was feeding, like Philip was wrong. Caroline was feeding Ammius, and he loved her so much. And of course he was never going to stay with Elsa, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is there. All the pieces of that are here. Like all of the pieces that would go into creating Five Little Pigs are really in this story, because that's what he has with Jane, and it's what Isobel just extinguishes.
Yeah. And of course, then you have Isobel and Winnie, and you realize, oh my gosh, they've lost two sources of income, one right after the other, right? With the loss of Jane and then the loss of Alan. So it's probably a good thing the nation bought those two paintings, because at this point, unless Isobel has glommed herself onto another person, that's what they're living on.
Yes, and that's very possible. I mean, the other thing I just want to bring up as to this love triangle here, that's obviously at the center of the story, is that on its surface, it does feel like a very classic and typical Agatha Christie love triangle, because it's two women and one man, right? And I have talked about this before. I think a lot of people like to, make comparisons between these fictional love triangles and the love triangle that we know existed in Christie's own life, which was about to come to a head very soon after the writing of this story, right? I mean, I have to imagine when Christie was writing this story, again, all just speculation, but that, the marriage was not going swimmingly at this point, even if she wasn't aware, because it apparently did come as such a surprise, even if she wasn't aware of the infidelity, again, whatever that infidelity actually meant, of her first husband with this other woman, right? But I think, and this is something that I also really explored when I did a Patreon episode, actually, for Giant's Bread, because we have a very similar kind of love triangle happening in that book. I think there's a lot of evidence, or at least there's one line here that I can use for evidence that I have to imagine Christie in some ways was actually putting herself in the position of the man in this love triangle, because the man is an artist. And in Giant's Bread, the man is a composer. It's music that he's creating rather than art. But I feel very strongly, as someone who I think believes in Agatha Christie as an artist as much as I do, and who feels sometimes frustrated by that Victorian/Edwardian sensibility that she had as a person, and I'm sure in particular as a woman, where she never really wanted to toot her own horn and talk all that much about her craft and put herself out there as an artist. I love looking for evidence of her doing that in oblique ways in her fiction. And there's this one line in the story where we're considering Everard's thoughts as to his work. And the line is, the thing was not quite as he had conceived it. It was this frustration that he was feeling with his paintings. And Christie talks about that a lot. Mm-hmm. The idea that you have this image of what you want your book to be, and then you write it, and it's never exactly as you conceived it, but you make it as good as you possibly can. It's always the best approximation that you as a fallible human can do, and as a talented writer. And that's why I think, and then There Were None is one of the ones, she says, I was so proud of myself because it was such a, she created such a high bar for herself, and she managed to clear it, right? And then some. So that was a case where like she did it, like she had a conception of it, and maybe it wasn't perfect, but she got damn near close, right? And I think there's so much of Christie, the artist, in these artist characters. And I would also include here, I'll mention another book that I thought of, one of my favorites, The Hollow, because I think Henrietta Savernick, the sculptor, is also Christie. And I think a lot of her thoughts as to art and her relationship with her art is very much Christie as well. So I love the idea that, this is a love triangle where perhaps if we place Christie in the position of the man, well, the big mistake that Alan Everard made with Isobel is that he kind of got taken in by a pretty face. And there was probably a lot of, sexual and sort of like personal attraction there, but maybe that had sort of was a little bit spent at this point. We know that Winnie is 5 years old. They've been married for a while. It's just interesting to think about that vis-a-vis Christie and Archie Christie, who Lucy Worsley reminds us in her recent biography was extremely hot. I believe she says incredibly hot. He was very handsome. It's just interesting to think about that relationship, which was about to come to a very painful end for her as she was writing the story and putting her in that position as the Alan Everard of the story.
Right. I completely agree, obviously. But I did want to take that as a launching off point to look back a little bit more to, again, back to the relationships among these three people. And we can think of it, of course, as a love triangle. And again, there's sort of a fourth person here in this relationship because, one of them is Winnie's mother and one of them is Winnie's godmother. So you actually have the three adults in this child. Mm-hmm. And one thing I think is really interesting is that we know that Alan Everard and Jane Haworth had been friends before Isobel came along, right? This is clearly a friendship that predates the advent of Isobel. And Isobel and Jane's relationship is kind of interesting, right? Because they're maintaining a separate correspondence.
Yeah.
Throughout this whole time. And in fact, Isobel, like we said earlier, right, it doesn't seem to have really had another social circle that she's interacting directly with, although Jane does. So Isobel and Jane, they have an odd relationship. But why is Jane Winnie's godmother at all? Did you ever ask yourself that while you were reading the story?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I guess because there was this pre-existing relationship, right, between Alan and Jane. But I mean, Isobel is a calculating person, right?
Right.
Keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's such an interesting choice because, I mean, heck, in the middle of this story, Winnie's 5 and Alan turns to Isobel and he says, but do you like Jane? Do you like her? It's like, whoa, if that matters, why was now the moment to ask it?
And the sort of unspoken answer is, again, if this is one way to look at Isobel, does Isobel like anyone?
Right.
Isobel makes use of people, right?
Right. I don't even think Isobel likes Isobel.
Exactly. I mean, that's not important. That's irrelevant. But that's, likes, dislikes, passions, those are parts of being alive, right? Like he's speaking the language of him and Jane to Coldfish Isobel, who is just not playing.
Right.
And Isobel wins in the end. Again, unlike in Five Little Pigs where Elsa loses, Isobel wins. And perhaps, as you said, to her own detriment, ultimately, she plays too hard because what she doesn't realize, it's the same way as with Elsa. One of the moments that makes those few pages at the end of Five Little Pigs as poignant as they are is that Elsa says, not only did I die, but I realized I didn't get any sort of revenge on Caroline. She was untouchable. Once I killed Ammius, she was gone too, basically. Like they both went off to another place together, which is an incredibly sentimental sort of romantic notion. But hey, Agatha Christie in the best of ways. There's nothing wrong with being sentimental if you're doing it with principles. And I think she does, especially in these Mary Westmacott-ish sorts of stories. I think there's that notion that, you know what, Isobel, you played your hand a little too hard because the final line, the light went out on Jane's portrait. Well, guess what? The light's going out on Alan real soon, right?
Exactly. And therefore you will be in the same situation as Elsa, which in the end, all three of you died.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there you are. Yeah. We haven't even touched on the fact, this whole aspect of this story that we haven't actually directly touched on yet, this idea that the eye of the artist, in order to get the soul of the subject onto the canvas, has to be cruel, has to paint with a vindictive brush.
Yeah.
In order to create good art. I mean, that's a whole other really interesting perspective to think about what it means to bring the soul to canvas, what it means to create good art, and why is the cruelty necessary?
It's a point that's very emphatically made in this story, and I think she actually does it with a little bit more nuance in The Hollow, but I think she's making the same point, because what I love at the end of The Hollow is when Henrietta, who truly loved John, right? Who, you know, she is mourning him, but she realizes, oh, I'm inspired right now. Yeah. And she apologizes to him, right? She's like, I'm sorry, but I need to go into the zone now and be an artist. And it's this idea that being an artist and being a human being are kind of mutually exclusive. And I think she's making a similar point here. And that too, I mean, these are the only moments in which I think Agatha Christie was willing to speak, the only way she was willing to speak about what it was like to create her art, because this is someone who wrote 66 full-length novels and then all these other hundreds of brilliant short stories like the one that we're discussing, plus the Mary Westmacott novels, you know, plus 2 works of nonfiction. And if you listen to her plain spoken words about this, she basically is saying, oh, well, you know, I would just run off when I wasn't rubbing the architectural finds with face cream and type out a few words in my tent, you know. And it's like, oh, come on, lady. Like, no, you're an art, like you're an amazing artist. Like, and here I think is where we can get a sense of what it was actually like for her and some of the sacrifices that she made, and, you know, getting that insight into her psyche a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. Which, I mean, like you said, the scene in this where Everhard talks about the fact that he couldn't quite bring his vision onto the canvas, and the scene that you sort of obliquely mentioned earlier without talking about it directly from The Hollow, which is just so excruciating, when Henrietta finds the perfect model for Nausicaa and then goes to create it and realizes that she hasn't got what she wants and absolutely has to destroy it before she's tempted not to. And it's one of the most excruciatingly painful moments, I think, actually, in the entire canon.
Yeah.
And it is interesting to see the way that it comes out here, and that realization at the end that without this irritant of the relationship with Jane, that he's just not going to be able to bring it to the canvas in any meaningful way anymore.
Yeah. And it's just so interesting, because whenever writers, it's like she needed that slight distance too of depicting artists who are not writing. Their medium is never words, when I think she's really commenting on what the artistic process is like. They're musicians or sculptors or painters. And then when it's writers, when it's Ariadne Oliver, it tends to be jokey, right? Like it at least tends to be light. There's a lot of the lightness there and the self-deprecating humor. And it's just so different. Her depiction of writers versus other kinds of artists. And I agree. I mean, that's one of the reasons why The Hollow is as brilliant as it is. And one other point I failed to make when I was bringing up Giant's Bread is that, in that one, it's all about music. And I actually think that if you make the argument, which I'm not completely making, that Within a Wall is the short story version of Giant's Bread, it's one of those instances in which I kind of prefer the short version, because I think that the core of all of the ideas is really, it's all there in Within a Wall. And a lot of what she does in Giant's Bread, and that was the first Mary Westmacott that she wrote, it gets very melodramatic. It's sort of like the plot twists are just crazy. And it felt to me, at least, like that novel goes off the rails, especially in its last like third to quarter. There's just like too much going on, too many things. And I think the clarity here, to me, it's a little bit like the situation in The Green Shore Folly, the novella version of Dead Man's Folly, which I actually really prefer. Like sometimes the leaner, meaner version is better, even though, I think most people would agree that Christie was a better novelist than a short story writer. But this is a short story, even in the cluing, right? Like that's such an exquisitely layered clue. I think sometimes in the short stories, the clues can be a little obvious. They don't have enough material within which to hide in the way that they do in the full length novels. But God, this short story is really firing on all cylinders.
It totally is. And I mean, many people would say the same thing about Plymouth Express and the Blue Train. So it's funny you said off the rails, right? When you add enough in to make it a full length story, it just winds up to be too much.
I wouldn't even say that about the Curious Incident of the Dog's Ball and Dumb Witness, but that's basically because I'm a Dumb Witness hater. That says more about my relative dislike of Dumb Witness than it does my love of the short story.
Yeah, Dumb Witness isn't probably in my very top of the list either. So you
don't have to be afraid to pile on Dumb Witness, Michelle, if you'd like.
I mean, There are some, the dog is great. There are some things about it that I love the dog pushing the ball down the stairs, but there are some things about it that it's just, whew, yeah. I did want to mention a couple of things about Alan Everard. So first of all, is that the description of him standing by the side of the room during the party, rattling the coppers in his pocket, also reminded me of all things of Cedric Krakenthorpe from 450 from Paddington. So I did want to give a little bit of love to another artist.
Yep.
Pops up much later in the canon because I very explicitly thought of him in particular in that setting. Also, another thing I wanted to say about Alan Everard, it's really tucked in there quite deeply, but there's the place where when he's leaving Jane's apartment, he steps out in front of a bus and he almost dies.
Yeah. Yes.
Right? He almost gets run over by a bus, and it's literally a throwaway. It's one sentence, and then you just kind of move on. And he's going on to do this other thing. But later, when I got to the end, when I'm wondering, well, wait a minute, how the heck did Alan Everard die? I wondered to myself, I wonder if he, stepped out in front of a bus, because he seemed to be the kind of person who would be that absent-minded and do that sort of thing. And
a little bit of like a Margaret Mitchell situation.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the last thing that I wanted to say, particularly about Alan, although I guess this is a Jane thing, did this strike you as well? Jane's diary. I don't know if you've ever kept a diary. I don't know if you're a journal person yourself. Jane's diary was written to Alan Everard.
Yeah.
Did you have a reaction to that?
I thought it was really interesting in general. I thought the way that Jane was depicted, with all of that sort of the openness and the generosity and all her, her many acquaintances, et cetera, et cetera. She has this full life. She's so alive. I found it surprising, which isn't to say unconvincing, but just surprising that she would choose to leave all of this stuff to Alan, because she chose him, right, to be the executor, and she left all this stuff behind for him to see and to sort of pore over. It showed, I think, a deep and abiding and burning passion, right? That clearly just resided within her at all times, and intensity of nature that was an important part of who she was. But yes, I mean, that is a bold choice. I mean, on Jane's part, but also on Christie's part as the creator of Jane. I definitely noted it, and it raised an eyebrow.
Right. And on top of, we know about the whole, there's an unreliable narrator at play, and therefore we don't necessarily know. As you say, she left Alan as her executor, and she intentionally left the diary. But it's written that she tried to burn all of the letters from Isobel, but basically that she accidentally left one behind because it fell behind a drawer. And I think the way this story is written invites us even to question the accidental nature of that act, right? That's how it's said. It's said that she leaves the diary, but she burns all the letters from Isobel, but one of them gets left behind. And that's how he actually cottons onto the whole scheme, because he winds up with this one Isobel letter. And it says in the story that it was an accident that one of them didn't get burned, because it says that Jane burned them when she knew the end was near or whatever. I think the way the story is written invites us to question whether or not it was truly accidental.
I completely agree. The way that Jane is depicted before, she dies is such that I would have expected in a more conventional story, she's the kind of character who never would have spoken a word about that passion or wanted Alan to know. She would be the sort of the silently suffering type. And it feels to me like this is her making a play, not for herself because she's dead, but for him, right? Like for basically being like, you know what? I'm beyond the grave. If I die, I want you to be able to escape the clutches of this horrible woman who you're with. It's like her attempt, and it's not ultimately successful, but she gives it a good go because it's surprising. It's like, oh, okay, you're going to let him know exactly how you felt. And then there's this letter here that he finds. Like it is very surprising.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's and again, I mean, we're taking apart. I mean, not taking apart in a bad way. I mean, we are really close reading here a quite short story.
Yeah, this is not one of her longer short stories by any means. I mean, it's like it's a medium Christie short story.
And there is just so much here. So this is the third time I will have said it, but I think it's important, right? The first question was, why do you like this story so much? Well, I should hope that it increasingly becomes obvious. It's one of those ones that keeps on giving. Every time you come back to it, you're like, oh. It took me a while. There's a scene at the very beginning when they talk about Alan Everard's relationship to Isobel, and it says that he feels that he's in debt to her.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, well, wait. Again, a very famous Christie tool, which is that you say something as a fact and you move on, counting on the fact that people aren't going to go, wait a minute, what?
Yeah.
What do you mean it was a daughter? What do you mean the fingerprints were only on the glass? What do you mean, right?
Yep.
And this is another one of those cases because you're like, wait, what would he have been in debt to Isobel Loring for? She didn't have any money.
Right. And it brings up a really interesting aspect of Isabel's characters we haven't even really touched on, which is that he's in debt to her because she chose him. Right. Yes. It's like he's in debt for her very being, for her beauty, basically, for having chosen him. And she is now his wife because she had all these other people. And that is significant because you know what? If Isobel was truly as superficial and two-dimensional as Georgie is portraying her to be, well, why wouldn't she have chosen the South African millionaire or, the member of nobility or any of the other eligible bachelors who were available to her, right? She's had some understanding to know he wasn't even a successful artist at that point, right? She has this instinct, this deep sort of understanding and intelligence to know, no, this is someone who's going to make something of himself and I want to align myself with him. And that ain't nothing, Right.
That is an impressive level of insight, even if she was deploying it in a
mercenary way. I mean, her motives are all mercenary. There's an argument being made that she is empty, but then given the way that she is set up as a character, there's also lots of evidence for the fact that, well, she can't be though, or she wouldn't have even chosen him in the first place. This was completely her choice. And even to the point, one of my favorite details actually in the story when we're first learning about Isobel is that she is such a presence in and of herself. And she made that presence known when she was still presumably, probably like an 18, 19, 20-year-old woman, a very young woman, that to this day, even after she's been married, she is only known by her maiden name. Everyone refers to her as Isobel Loring, not Isobel Everard. The marriage has not subsumed her. That's how powerful of a presence she is. Yes. I love that.
And that little piece about Isobel, her history and her character goes on to describe the phrases Isobel's talent for success, right? Which is a really interesting turn of phrase. It's a really exciting way to put that because Isobel doesn't have the talent to necessarily be successful, but to identify the capacity for success and turn it in the direction that's going to benefit to her. She can. But that goes on to talk about the painting Color, which of course is the first painting, the one with the navvy, where Everhard says that there is no symbolism in it. But what I thought was really interesting is this is yet another case of I'm going to say one thing and then show you another. He says there's no symbolism in the painting, but then he goes on to offer what can only be taken as a symbolic explanation of its meaning. He had a sudden longing for a riot of purely English color, as if that's not itself rife with subtext and symbolism in terms of what that painting is showing.
Right. It's like she's putting us on notice, and that's early in the story. It's sort of like these two conflicting things can exist at the same time. Like there's more than meets the eye here to what I'm telling you. Absolutely.
And just the continuous unreliability of the narration.
Yes. And I think too, I mean, let's talk for a second about Georgie's not relationship with, but sort of depiction of Mrs. Lempriere. I mean, it starts from the very first sentence. He's very almost accusatory when it comes to her. And I think this is where you can also read in some doubt as to the way that he's portraying Isobel, because they're sort of similar characters, right? Where it's like, well, Mrs. Lempriere, she basically could ferret out things, and she had great taste and she had great instinct, but there's this sense from Georgie, but she was really awful and everyone hated her. And it's like, she sounds kind of fun to me. I don't know. Like she sounds great.
Right. Easily the most hated woman in London. And I think this is the point, by the way, where we want to make sure that we feed all of our Christie fandom and remind ourselves.
I know where you're going.
Yeah, of course you do. But that Joan West's first name before she got subsumed by being married was Joyce Lempriere.
That's right. I mean, I think that Joyce must be, and let's keep in mind too, those short stories in which Joyce Lempriere appears are, those early Miss Marple short stories, which were all published in the late 1920s. So very soon after this story was published. So I feel like Joyce is definitely the niece of Mrs. Lempriere. For some reason, I don't think she's her mother. I think she's her aunt. But in the art world, she clearly mentored her niece very, very well.
I was going to say that's the thing, because they do share that. But I think you're right. The relationship between Georgie and Mrs. L is really, it's kind of a whole thing, because they're having this long conversation. I mean, they're moving stuff around in an artist's studio, which aren't even necessarily things that they probably should have been touching.
Right. No, I mean, she literally like takes it. It's facing the wall, right? The sketch of Jane is facing the wall. And Mrs. Lempriere is just like, oh, what's this?
Exactly. And you're like, okay, rude, but.
Well, and that's what I mean too about the intrusive nature of the story that Georgie tells us of what happened among these three people. Like, we are so in a nuclear way put on notice as to that intrusive nature. And the fact that like, this is one person's spin who wasn't even involved. And like, God, when you're talking about marriage and, the relationship between two people like Alan Everard and Jane, who probably knew each other since they were children, or at least were very young. And that's what it feels like. Who knows? These are such hard relationships, I think, to fathom and to make sense of. So take this with a grain of salt, or at least feel free to think more deeply about this. I mean, she's doing that here by the way that she's framing this story and showing these people, Mrs. Lempriere and Georgie, getting into Alan Everard's business here, where he's miserably shuffling coins in his pockets and looking at them and probably wanting them to get out of his studio and stop prying into like all of his old stuff. In the same way, that's probably how he'd feel about the story that Georgie is telling, but he's dead.
Well, right. And places where he is and is not willing to tell people to get out of business that they don't belong in, or who he thinks should or should not be able to tell other people what to do, is made particularly interesting, I think, by the interaction that he has with Jane about her daily woman, right? Because he goes up to the fourth floor flat, right? And the daily woman is intoxicated and sitting in the kitchen instead of opening the door. And so he's mad that he had to climb up to the fourth floor flat. He's mad that nobody answered the door right away. What I do think is interesting is that he doesn't say, he's not mad because Jane lives this really inconvenient life that's inconvenient for her. He's mad because this fourth floor flat has made her unget-atable, is the word in the story, which I think is really interesting. But then he actually has the nerve to turn to Jane and tell her to get rid of a woman from her life who isn't doing what she's supposed to be doing. And I'm like, ooh, that's a little kind of on the nose there, Alan, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's one thing that Jane is willing to have pictures of babies that aren't hers on her walls, but it's also interesting that Alan is willing to look at a picture of a baby and wait, let me find the quote, what he calls that baby. I suppose you'll pretend that you like having that atrocious infant squinting at you all day. Who talks about a baby that way that they see a picture of? I mean, we've all probably looked at babies every now and then and been like, oh, okay, not the most beautiful baby I've ever seen, but who says it aloud? Alan Everard, apparently.
Apparently. But again, that also, I think that speaks to his relationship with Jane, right? And the way he's able to be frank with her about a wide variety of topics and not just, and particularly a wide variety of aesthetic topics.
Yes.
Which he isn't able to do with the other people who exist in his personal life or social milieu. I think it's really important.
Absolutely. Especially Isobel.
Especially Isobel.
Especially his wife. That's true. And on that, actually, I just had to mention that the dynamic between Everard and Isobel, very much the first thing I thought of when they were introduced. It reminded me so much of Dr. Lydgate and his wife Rosamond, née Vincy in Middlemarch, in George Eliot's Middlemarch. I mean, that is such a central relationship in that novel. The poor, the
Yes.
doctor marries badly. He does not make a good
Right.
decision. And she sort of just carries him ever downward because she is unwilling to economize, essentially. She is
Right.
unwilling to live in a certain way. And she just doesn't get it. She doesn't get that he is interested. He's passionate about science and he
Right.
wants to be able to carry on his research. And not only does she not care about his research, but she's not even willing to conduct the household in such a way that would support him in that. And it's just a disaster. It's played for some laughs in the story, but it's actually very tragic and horrible. I mean, his life is ruined. And to some extent, her life is ruined too, because she thought she was getting something out of this marriage that she didn't get. And it's such a convincing portrait of a marriage gone wrong. And it's really stuck with me just as much as all the Dorothea Brooke stuff and Dorothea and Casaubon from that novel. That, people don't talk about Dr. Lydgate as much, but that I immediately thought of it. And I'm sure that Agatha Christie read Middlemarch because she read all the big ones. She didn't reference George Eliot. I don't think she ever referenced George Eliot in the canon, although if anyone can prove me wrong on that.
The Mill on the Floss.
Oh, did she reference The Mill on the Floss once?
Murder of Roger Ackroyd, right?
Oh, okay. There you go.
Flora Ackroyd, I believe, doesn't she mention The Mill on the Floss? Why I don't understand why people collect things. If you like The Mill on the Floss, why don't you just buy a cheap paperback of The Mill on the Floss and read it rather than buying a first edition?
I don't remember that, but yeah, I mean, she certainly referenced Dickens and Thackeray a lot more because she's always referencing Dobbin.
But I do think that's another interesting thing about Within a Wall, and I mentioned this earlier, is the vast amount of pop culture references that are packed into this really short amount of space. Because, I, in rereading this story, did go a little bit down a rabbit hole of looking up things about Poppy and Mandragora. Right around that time, there's a poem from 1911. It's in the University of Michigan Digital Library in the American Verse Project, so you could even probably link to it. There's an Aldous Huxley essay that comes much later. There was a painting by Rosa M. Town in 1897. There's a Dorothy Parker quote. Anyway, it was really widely in the kind of popular imagination at that point, this idea that because of the opium issues, that Poppy and Mandragora, and it's always been interesting to me that is not what she chose to use in the titling of this story, because instead she pulls the title from a very old riddle that was also published widely in books of nursery rhymes, and it's the Within a Wall riddle that is kind of becomes the central interaction of the story, and then affords the framing, the framing for the final scene. But I always thought that was interesting because she talks about Isobel and the Poppy and Mandragora so much more.
It's true. I mean, Poppy and Mandragora could easily be an alternate title for this. But what I love is that technically this is one of Christie's nursery rhyme stories, right? It's a nursery rhyme title.
Yay.
It's all there, all of the Christie classics.
All there, all the time. Well, and the fact that we get a reference to Happy Families, the card game.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
I think a lot of it too is that, we have this narrator. There's a lot of asides. They're quippy asides. She's establishing his voice because he is very much a man of the world. And in that way, it's sort of like this Nick Carraway. He's separate, but he's supposed to be of our world. He's kind of like drawing us in. And I think a lot of those asides help establish that relationship between the narrator and the reader, if that makes sense.
Right. Which is interesting that one of the other places in the Christie canon where she most famously references Happy Families is in 3-Act Tragedy, which has Mr. Satterthwaite in it, in a very unusual role for Mr. Satterthwaite to be playing in a Poirot novel.
Yes. And I kid you not, Michelle, that was literally the last thing that I was going to mention is that, I think we've touched on, obviously, Poirot stories and even, Miss Marple characters, if not stories. Well, there's always Bloodstained Pavement if you want a love triangle, for example. But I think we can even get an echo of Mr. Satterthwaite-esque kind of character in Georgie as well. I mean, this idea, it's that observing from the sidelines and trying to make sense, almost in the way of an alien looking on the margins and looking in on these people who are taking active roles and trying to make sense of what's happening and what these stories are. Obviously, it's much more traditional mystery in the Mr. Quinn and Mr. Satterthwaite stories, but they're kind of playing similar roles. Like I got a whiff of Mr. Satterthwaite here.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And like I said, even though of course, the happy families come out in 3-act tragedy with, Mr. Mugg, but here it comes out and it's a line that the narrator, Georgie, attributes to Everard about Mr. Potts, the painter, Mrs. Potts, the painter's wife. But we know that every single line spoken by anybody in the narrative attributed to that person was put into their mouth by Georgie.
Right.
So the extent to which they actually might have said any of these things is completely in question. So I think it's very astute to think of that as being one of the ways that Georgie, the narrator, is trying to make sense of this in his worldly way. I love that.
Yeah, it's all in question. And I think this is another one of those stories of Christie's that is helpful to remember when textual evidence is needed to push back against what I've always thought of was an oversimplification of the detective fiction genre, which is these are stories that have neat resolutions and that provide catharsis in, a disordered world. There's a lot of validity to that, of course. Like I'm not saying that detective fiction can't be read that way and hasn't been read that way for decades now or nearly a century, right? But that doesn't mean that there aren't alternate readings and that some of the stories that still fit under, the mantle of detective fiction don't necessarily have tidy endings, or their endings can be read in different ways. And I think sometimes with some of these Christie stories, you really have to do a deep reading to get there, which is fine because I'm happy to do the deep reading. But this is a story where I think she really is, even though you can read this story, I think with a much simpler gloss on it, it's pretty obvious that she is injecting ambiguity or vagueness into this story. And I think practically begging the reader to take another look at this or, just think about what's really happening here and what it all means.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think our conversation has really made it clear, right? A is that the story in and of itself is really, really good, but the story with the frame is absolutely extraordinary. And I absolutely stick by this. And I think it's one of those things where from the first time I read it in 1997 until the last time I read it, which was literally just before we talked today, I read it for probably the 300th time. And I was still absolutely, completely as taken with it at this reading as I had been the first time I read it, however many years ago that was.
Yeah. This is a story that, it's very, very obviously a modernist story. This is a story that I think easily belongs with a lot of other literature that was being created around that time, including The Great Gatsby, right? And I think it's so easy for people to dismiss Christie because she's so darn entertaining, right? That's her double-edged sword. It's sort of like, it's so easy to read these stories. I think sometimes we don't always take the time to think as deeply about them, not as we ought to. I don't, want to be prescriptive here, but as we can, if we choose to, because we can get so much out of it, right?
Right, because I think you're right. There is no harm, no foul in reading Christie for the entertainment that it was sold as, because it's really spectacular at that.
Yeah.
And all the things that made her brilliant, the fact that she can be so parsimonious, which means that the reads can be quick and the reads can be easy. Yeah. And the fact that she's so funny. We identified so many funny moments in this. And that's something that our friend Mark Aldridge often brings up too, right? Is that people forget she's so funny. Mm-hmm. I was making my mother listen to Agatha Christie audiobooks on a car trip the other day, and she's not even a Christie fan. And she found herself kind of laughing out loud at moments that I was also thinking, oh, that's really, really funny. Not necessarily this story, but I do think it's important. It's all here. And you kept saying that as we were talking, right? Everything Christie does somehow is in this story, yet it doesn't feel crowded.
Not at all. Not at all. Well, I was reminded while I was making notes for this, I was reminded of something that you said, Michelle, in one of your many emails to me, which I read out on the podcast. I think you were talking about the soul of the croupier, but you said, in so many of these stories, to talk around what Christie is doing, to sort of summarize the plot and, do a character breakdown and just sort of to talk about it rather than just to read the story itself really sells it short because it seems manipulative or melodramatic or cheesy or whatever. You kind of just have to read it, which is the mark of a great writer, right? Like of a great artist. And I think that's the case for this too. I mean, we could talk for hours more about this story and you would think that it must be so dense and tortured almost to read, but my God, no, it's a breeze. It's a breeze, just like pretty much everything she wrote is.
Right. Exactly.
You know what? I mean, I opened this conversation by asking you, Michelle, why is this your favorite story? I'm comfortable closing this conversation by turning the tables on myself and asking Kemper Donovan, why is this not my favorite short story of Agatha Christie's? I'm going to have to sit with that for a while because I'm not sure I have a good answer to that right now.
Kemper, do you have a favorite short story of Agatha Christie's?
Well, we did, at the Agatha Christie Festival last year, we did crown Christie's greatest short story, but that is, that is an exercise in ranking, which is not the same as identifying one's favorite. And I actually can you believe I haven't really thought about that? So I'm going to have to think about that. I'm not sure what my answer is. That's my honest answer. I don't know.
And this one isn't one of the puzzle mysteries either. So, I mean, there's a wide variety of arguments. Does it go into a different category with the other non-puzzle mysteries? Because, again, among these non-puzzle mysteries, there are some, people think that Agatha Christie couldn't write spooky until you read them The Last Seance. And then they're just constantly looking over their shoulder.
Or the dressmaker's doll. Ooh. Yeah, no, I don't know. Because even again, she's doing, I love how sometimes in the non-puzzle mystery, she still is exercising some of the same muscles that she does in her more traditional stories, like with that cluing. I mean, that is that is expert cluing there in the beginning of the story. So I don't know, I'm gonna have to think about it. But you know what? This is certainly a contender after this conversation. Michelle, thank you so much for coming on again and speaking at great length about the story. I mean, this was just every time I talk to you, either on mic or not, it's one of those rare moments where I feel like, I'm speaking with someone who loves this stuff as much as I do. And it's really a joy to connect with someone in this way. So thank you for coming on and speaking about Within a Wall with me.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity more than you will ever know.
Thank you again to Dr. Michelle Kazmer. What a joy it was to geek out with her on this episode that I'm putting out for the holidays, at least here in the United States. And in that same vein, for my next episode, 3 weeks from now, I will be fortunate enough to have another returning co-host join me to geek out over yet another original Agatha Christie short story that is new to this podcast. The Reverend Dr. Sarah Hinlicky Wilson will be on, and we will discuss one of the remaining short stories within the Star Over Bethlehem collection that has not yet been covered. This time around, it will be Promotion in the Highest that we are discussing. A very religious story, very Christian story, as all of the stories within that collection are, and it just feels right to cover them around the Christmas holiday. So I'm very much looking forward to that. And if you want even more Christmas festivities by way of the All About Agatha podcast, head on over to the podcast's Patreon page, because I am doing my usual Christmas-themed Patreon for December. I will be covering a short story and an episode of television. Maigret's Christmas by Georges Simenon. That's the short story I'm covering, a rather long short story. And the Inside Number 9 episode, The Devil of Christmas. Love that show, Inside Number 9, and cannot wait to discuss it on the Patreon. So I provided a link to Patreon in the show notes if you'd like to check that out. As I mentioned at the top of this episode, especially for readers in the United States, if you are planning on buying the second book in my mystery series, Loose Lips, I would love if you could pre-order my book. I've provided a link for that in the show notes as well. And hey, if you're looking for a gift for that mystery-loving person in your life, may I suggest The Busybody, the first book in my mystery series? links for the purchase of that book in the show notes as well. You can find the podcast on Twitter at All About the Dame and on Instagram at All About Agatha. You can find me on Facebook at Kemper Donovan Books or at my author website, kemperdonovan.com. And you can email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. Please do. I love hearing from any and all listeners. And of course, I appreciate any ratings or reviews you might be able to provide for the podcast, because it means that I can reach more people and spread the joy and good cheer of our shared love of Agatha Christie. Ho, ho, ho. For all of you in the United States, happy Thanksgiving. For the rest of you, happy Thursday. And I'll see you next time. Bye.